The arena was full. 17,000 people packed into every seat, every aisle, every corner of the building, the collective heat of their bodies turning the air thick and electric. It was the kind of crowd that didn't just fill a room, it consumed it. They had driven hours. They had waited in lines that wrapped around city blocks. They had dressed in their best clothes, because this was not just a concert. This was communion. This was Elvis. And in 1977, seeing Elvis Presley live was not something you simply attended. It was something that happened to you. The lights in the arena had been dimmed for nearly 15 minutes. The opening act had finished long ago. The band was on stage, the TCB band, legendary in their own right. Instruments ready, amplifiers humming with that low electric anticipation that crawls under your skin. The drummer had already done 2 quiet rolls just to keep his hands warm. The backup singers, the sweet inspirations, stood in formation, microphones angled, eyes fixed on the curtain at stage right, where Elvis always appeared. Everyone was looking at that curtain. Every single person in the building was staring at the same dark fold of fabric, waiting for it to move. It didn't move. Behind that curtain, down a narrow concrete corridor lit by buzzing fluorescent tubes, Elvis Aaron Presley stayed completely still. He was dressed. The jumpsuit was on, white with gold embroidery, the cape draped across his shoulders, the belt cinched and heavy with rhinestones. His hair was done. His scarves were folded and ready to be handed out to the front rows. Everything about his appearance said he was ready to perform. But Elvis was not moving. He was standing in the middle of the hallway with his arms at his sides, his chin slightly lowered, his eyes open, but focused on something that existed in a place no one else could see. Joe Esposito, his road manager, and one of the most trusted members of his inner circle, stood 6 feet away.
Joe had seen Elvis before every kind of show, the triumphant ones, the sloppy ones, the medicated ones, the magical ones. He had seen Elvis walk on stage with 103-degree fever and bring an audience to its knees. He had seen Elvis perform through back pain so severe he couldn't stand during rehearsal, but somehow stood for 2 hours under the lights. Joe had seen everything, but he had never seen this. He had never seen Elvis simply stop. Not freeze. Freezing implies panic, implies a malfunction. This was something else. This was a man who had arrived at a door he no longer wanted to open. Joe stepped closer. "E," he said, using the name only the inner circle used. "E, they're ready for you." Elvis didn't respond. His eyes didn't move. His chest rose and fell with slow, measured breaths, as though he was deliberately controlling each one, as though breathing itself had become a conscious decision rather than an automatic function. Joe looked back at the rest of the entourage. Charlie Hodge, Lamar Fike, a couple of security guys, a wardrobe assistant clutching a backup scarf. Every face reflected the same expression, confusion sharpening into concern. This wasn't a tantrum. This wasn't a negotiation tactic. This was something none of them had a playbook for. "E," Joe said again, softer this time. He reached out and touched Elvis's arm. The fabric of the jumpsuit was cool despite the heat in the corridor. Elvis flinched, not dramatically, but enough. A small involuntary contraction of muscle, the kind that happens when you're pulled out of a place you didn't realize you'd gone to. He turned his head slowly and looked at Joe. And Joe Esposito would later tell people that what he saw in Elvis's eyes at that moment changed his understanding of the man he'd worked alongside for nearly 2 decades. There was no anger, no confusion, no drug haze. Elvis's eyes were clear, painfully, almost unnaturally clear. And in them was something Joe could only describe one way: knowing. Not knowing like intelligence, knowing like dread. Like a man who had been told something that had rearranged every molecule of his understanding, and the weight of that knowledge was pressing down on him from the inside. Elvis leaned in. He leaned close enough that Joe could smell the cologne and the faint chemical undertone of whatever medications were working through his system, and he whispered something. Joe had to tilt his head. The words were so quiet they barely existed. They were more breath than voice, more vibration than language. But Joe heard them, and the color drained from his face so completely that Charlie Hodge took a step forward, thinking Joe was about to collapse. Joe straightened up. He didn't repeat what Elvis said. He didn't look at anyone. He turned, walked to the wall-mounted phone at the end of the corridor, and dialed a number from memory. No one knew who he called. No one asked, because the look on Joe's face made it clear that asking would be a mistake. But here's what makes this moment so unsettling, so impossible to simply dismiss and move on from. Elvis Presley had never refused to perform. Not once. In over 2 decades of relentless touring, in over 1,000 concerts, through illness and exhaustion and personal devastation, through the dissolution of his marriage and the pharmaceutical fog that increasingly blurred the edges of his world, Elvis had never once stood in a hallway and simply refused to walk on stage. He had performed with kidney problems so severe doctors begged him to cancel. He had performed on nights when he could barely remember the words to his own songs. He had performed 2 shows in one night, back to back, because Colonel Parker had double booked him and the contracts were already signed. The stage was the one place Elvis always went. It was his temple, his escape, the only space where the chaos of his life organized itself into something beautiful. So when he stopped, when he stood in that corridor and the minutes ticked by and the crowd noise grew louder and more restless and the band began exchanging nervous glances and the promoters started pacing and Colonel Parker started making threats through a phone line from somewhere far away, every person in that hallway understood on a primal, unspoken level that whatever was happening was not ordinary. Something had broken, or something had revealed itself, and no one knew which was worse. But then something strange happened. After what witnesses estimate was somewhere between 15 and 20 minutes, 20 minutes of silence and stillness and a kind of spiritual paralysis that made the air in that corridor feel heavy enough to choke on, Elvis moved. He didn't announce it. He didn't give a signal. He simply began walking. One step, then another. His cape swayed behind him. His boots clicked on the concrete floor. He walked past Joe, who was still on the phone and nearly dropped the receiver. He walked past Charlie, who instinctively fell into step beside him. He walked toward the curtain, toward the noise, toward the 17,000 people who had no idea what had just happened and would never fully know. And just before he reached the stage entrance, just before the lights and the sound and the overwhelming tidal force of public adoration swallowed him whole, he paused one more time. He turned to Charlie Hodge. His lips moved. Charlie heard the words, and his hand shot out, grabbing Elvis's forearm with a grip that was equal parts desperation and disbelief. Charlie would later tell people what Elvis said. He would tell it quietly, reluctantly, and always with the caveat that he still didn't fully understand what it meant. Elvis had said, "I can hear her in the building." Her. Not a fan, not a backup singer.
Not anyone who was supposed to be there. Her. And Charlie knew, everyone who heard it knew, exactly who Elvis was talking about. Gladys Love Presley. His mother. Dead since August 14th, 1958. But to understand why those words carried the weight they did, to understand why Charlie Hodge grabbed Elvis's arm like a man trying to stop someone from stepping off a ledge, you have to go back. Not to that night, not even to that week. You have to go back to what had been happening at Graceland in the days before. Because the night Elvis refused to sing didn't begin at the arena. It began in a dream. And the dream began with a dead woman standing at the foot of his bed, holding out her hand, waiting for her son to take it. What was Elvis dreaming? What did Gladys show him? And what was the phone call at 2:47 a.m. that changed everything? Direct. Graceland in the summer of 1977 was not the museum the world knows today. It was not roped off and reverent and filled with guided whispers. It was a living, breathing, deeply strange place, a mansion that functioned simultaneously as a fortress, a pharmacy, a playground, and a prison. The gates kept the world out, but they also kept Elvis in, and by that summer the distinction between protection and confinement had blurred beyond recognition. Elvis rarely left. He rarely needed to. Everything came to him: food, friends, women, doctors, spiritual advisors, karate instructors, guns, jewelry, books about the occult, books about religion, books about death. The rooms of Graceland were saturated with the contradictions of a man who wanted to understand everything and could escape nothing. Upstairs, in the bedroom suite that no one entered without invitation, the curtains were permanently drawn. Not closed, drawn, as in sealed, as in nailed in some places to the window frames, so that not a single blade of daylight could penetrate. Elvis had always preferred the dark. He slept during the day and lived at night, a schedule that had begun as a practical necessity during his early performing years and had calcified over time into something more pathological. By 1977, his relationship with sleep had become adversarial. He needed it desperately. He pursued it with a cocktail of sedatives and barbiturates that would have killed most men. And yet sleep, when it came, had started to betray him. The dreams began, as far as anyone can pinpoint, sometime in late May or early June. Elvis mentioned them first to his cousin Billy Smith, who along with his wife Jo lived in a small house on the Graceland property and served as one of Elvis's closest and most constant companions. Billy was not part of the glamour. He was not a manager or an agent or a spiritual guru. He was family, real family, blood family, and Elvis trusted him with the kind of truths he would never speak to the entourage members who depended on him for their livelihoods. It was around 3 a.m. Elvis had come downstairs to the kitchen, which was unusual because he typically had food brought to him. Billy found him sitting at the small breakfast table in the back of the kitchen, not eating, just sitting with his hands flat on the table surface, as though he was steadying himself against something invisible. Billy asked if he was hungry. Elvis shook his head. Billy asked if he wanted company. Elvis nodded. And then, without preamble, without the dramatic buildup that usually accompanied Elvis's storytelling, he said it. "I keep dreaming about Mama." Billy sat down. He didn't react outwardly because he had learned over the years that reacting to Elvis's statements too quickly could shut him down. Elvis talked when he felt safe, and safety for Elvis meant the absence of judgment. So Billy sat and waited. Elvis described the dream. It was not a normal dream, not the fragmented, shifting nonsense that constitutes most human dreaming. It was precise.
It was architectural. It repeated. In the dream, Elvis was lying in his bed at Graceland, the same bed, the same room, the same darkness. He was aware that he was sleeping, which gave the whole experience a layered quality, a dream within a waking life that had itself begun to feel dreamlike. And at the foot of the bed, standing in the space between the mattress and the wall where the television was mounted, was Gladys. Not a young Gladys, not the vibrant, fierce, protective mother of his childhood in Tupelo. This was the Gladys of her final years, heavier, tired, her face carrying the particular exhaustion of a woman who had worried herself into illness. But her eyes were different. In life, Gladys's eyes had been warm and wet and constantly moving, tracking her son with a vigilance that bordered on obsession. In the dream, her eyes were still. Completely, impossibly still. And they were focused on Elvis with an intensity that he described to Billy as seeing through me into something behind me. She didn't speak. That was the part that disturbed Elvis the most. Gladys Presley had been a talker in life, effusive, emotional, given to long, rambling monologues about her fears for her son's safety and her conviction that the world was trying to take him away from her. The silence was wrong. It was anti-Gladys. It was the absence of everything she had been. But she was doing something. She was holding out her hand, her right hand extended toward Elvis, palm up, fingers slightly curved, in a gesture that was unmistakably an invitation. "Come with me. Take my hand. Follow me somewhere." Elvis told Billy that in the dream he wanted to reach for her. Every fiber of his being wanted to take his mother's hand. But something stopped him. Not fear, exactly. Something more like the instinct that tells you not to look directly at an eclipse, the understanding that what you're witnessing is beautiful and natural and will destroy you if you get too close.
He would wake up at that point, every time. He would wake up with his hand actually extended in the darkness of his bedroom, reaching toward the foot of the bed where no one stood. And every time, the room would be empty, and the silence would be absolute, and the absence of his mother would hit him with a grief so fresh it felt brand new, as though she had died not 19 years ago, but 19 seconds ago. Billy listened to all of this without interrupting. When Elvis finished, Billy asked the only question that mattered. "How many times have you had this dream?" Elvis looked at him, and the answer landed in the kitchen like a stone dropped into still water. "Every night for 2 weeks." Billy felt something cold move through his chest. Not because he was superstitious, although growing up in the Presley family in rural Mississippi meant that superstition was woven into the fabric of daily life like thread in a quilt. He felt it because of the way Elvis said it. There was no drama in his voice, no performance.
Elvis was telling him a fact the way you might tell someone the weather. It's raining. It's cold. My dead mother visits me every night and asks me to take her hand. But then something changed. The dreams escalated. Elvis told Larry Geller about this. Larry Geller, his hairdresser turned spiritual advisor, a man who had introduced Elvis to Eastern philosophy, numerology, and a sprawling library of metaphysical texts that Elvis devoured with the hunger of someone searching for an answer to a question he couldn't quite articulate. Larry had been with Elvis since the mid-60s and had survived being temporarily banished by Colonel Parker, who viewed Larry's spiritual influence as a threat to his commercial control over Elvis. By 1977, Larry was back in the inner circle, and Elvis confided in him with an intensity that sometimes frightened Larry himself. The dreams, Elvis told Larry, had changed. Gladys was no longer just standing at the foot of the bed.
She was showing him things. Not telling, showing. Without words, without sound, she would turn and gesture for Elvis to follow, and in the dream he would rise from the bed and walk behind her through the rooms of Graceland. But it wasn't the real Graceland. The rooms were slightly wrong. Hallways that extended too far, doors that opened into spaces that didn't exist, staircases that led downward into parts of the house that had no architectural basis in reality. And Gladys would lead him through these spaces slowly, patiently, the way she used to walk him to school when he was small and frightened and the other children were cruel. She led him, in one dream, to a room he had never seen. It was small, white, tiled. There was a coldness to it that felt clinical, institutional. Elvis described it to Larry as looking like a bathroom, but not a bathroom. The proportions were wrong. The light was wrong. Everything about it suggested a space designed for a function he didn't want to understand. In this room, Gladys stopped. She turned to face him, and for the first time in all the dreams, she did something different. She looked at the wall to her left. Elvis followed her gaze. On the wall was a clock, a small, ordinary clock, the kind you'd find in a doctor's office or a hospital, and the clock showed a specific time. Elvis told Larry the time. Larry never revealed it publicly. He carried it with him for decades and spoke about it only in the vaguest terms, saying that when Elvis told him the time on the clock, he felt a physical sensation in his stomach, a dropping, a hollowing, that he associated with the one and only time he had been in a car accident, that split-second moment when you know impact is coming, and there is absolutely nothing you can do. No one noticed it at first. The people around Elvis, the Memphis Mafia, the staff, the various hangers-on who populated Graceland like satellites orbiting a dying star, most of them didn't know about the dreams.
They knew Elvis was sleeping more. They knew he was quieter. They attributed it to the medications, to the weight gain that was visibly affecting his confidence, to the general entropy that had been slowly dismantling the most famous man in the world for the better part of a decade. But small things were happening that should have been warnings. Elvis gave away the sapphire ring. It was his mother's ring, a piece of jewelry he had kept in a specific drawer in his bedroom since Gladys's death, and had never, in 19 years, offered to another human being. He gave it to a housekeeper. Not his most trusted housekeeper, not someone with deep personal significance, a woman who had been working at Graceland for less than a year. He pressed it into her palm on a Tuesday afternoon and said, "You'll take better care of it." She was so startled she nearly gave it back, but something in Elvis's expression stopped her. It was the expression of a man who was putting his affairs in order. Then there were the photographs. Elvis asked someone, accounts differ on who, to gather every photograph of Gladys that existed in the house. Framed photos from hallways, loose prints from drawers, albums from closets. He wanted them all brought to his bedroom. When the collection was assembled, it reportedly filled an entire section of his bed. Elvis spent hours going through them, not casually, methodically, as though he was looking for something specific in her face across the years, some clue, some confirmation, some piece of evidence that what his dreams were showing him was real. He canceled a meeting with Colonel Parker. This alone should have triggered alarm bells. Elvis did not cancel meetings with the Colonel. Their relationship was toxic and codependent, and governed by contracts and obligations that Elvis felt bound to honor even when he despised them. Canceling a meeting with Parker was not a scheduling adjustment. It was an act of defiance.
Or perhaps more accurately, an act of irrelevance,
as though whatever Parker wanted to discuss had become so cosmically unimportant that Elvis couldn't summon the energy to pretend it mattered. And then came the phone call. The call at 2:47 a.m. The call that no one was supposed to know about, and that everyone eventually learned about in fragments, in whispers, in the way that secrets inside Graceland had a half-life measured in hours rather than years. Elvis answered the phone himself. This was unusual to the point of being almost unprecedented. Elvis had people for that. Elvis had people for everything. The phone rang in his bedroom suite, not the main house line, but a private line that only a handful of people have the number for. He picked it up. He spoke for 11 minutes. The conversation was entirely one-sided, as far as anyone could hear from outside the door. Elvis listening, occasionally murmuring what sounded like acknowledgments, small verbal nods that carried no information. When the call ended, he did not hang up the phone immediately. He held the receiver against his chest for a long moment, as though the voice on the other end was still speaking, and he was absorbing it through his body rather than his ears. Then he placed the phone back in its cradle. He sat on the edge of his bed, and he said 5 words. 5 words spoken to an empty room, or perhaps to a presence that had become permanent, or perhaps to himself in the voice of a man who has just had his last illusion stripped away. The words were heard by a member of his staff who was standing outside the bedroom door, not eavesdropping, simply stationed there as was protocol during Elvis's waking hours. This person heard the words clearly. They carried through the heavy door with the authority of a confession. And for years afterward, this person told almost no one, because the words didn't make sense. They shouldn't have made sense.
And yet they arrived with a certainty that made doubt feel like cowardice. What Elvis said, sitting alone on the edge of his bed at 2:58 in the morning, 48 hours before a concert he would initially refuse to perform, was this: she was right about the room. The room. The white room. The tiled room. The room that looked like a bathroom but wasn't a bathroom. The room that Gladys had shown him in a dream. But who was on the phone? Who had confirmed what the dream had shown? And how could anyone, alive or dead, psychic or prophet, know about a room that Elvis had only seen in visions conjured by his unconscious mind in the deepest hours of pharmaceutical sleep? That question sat at the center of everything that happened next, and no one who has ever tried to answer it has emerged from the attempt without feeling that they've touched something they were never meant to touch. Because 2 days later, Elvis would stand in a corridor and refuse to sing. And the reason, the real reason, the one that lived underneath the medications and the exhaustion and the weight of being Elvis Presley, was waiting for him on a stage, in the lights, in the sound of 17,000 voices calling a name that had begun to feel less like an identity and more like a sentence. What happened on that stage was unlike anything Elvis had ever done. He put the microphone down. He turned his back on 17,000 people, and then he began to sing a song that wasn't his, a song that belonged to a dead woman. What was the song? And why did a woman in the front row collapse when she heard it? The walk from the corridor to the stage was 47 feet. Elvis had made this walk, or walks like it, thousands of times. 47 feet of concrete and shadow, and then the world explodes. That was the geometry of his life. Darkness into light, silence into roar, nobody into everybody.
He had been making that walk since he was 19 years old, since a skinny kid from Tupelo with a crooked smile and a voice that didn't belong to any category the music industry had ever created, stepped into the blinding white heat of public adoration and never fully stepped out of it again. 47 feet. He could walk it in his sleep. He had walked it in his sleep, or something close to it, on nights when the medications turned his body into an automated system, legs moving, arms swinging, smile deploying, while the real Elvis retreated to some interior room where the noise couldn't reach him. But this time, the walk felt different. Every person flanking him could sense it. Charlie Hodge walked to his right, still shaken by what Elvis had said. I can hear her in the building, and trying desperately to interpret it as something manageable, something that could be filed under exhaustion or medication, or the kind of poetic abstraction that Elvis sometimes used when he was in one of his spiritual moods. But Charlie couldn't file it. The words sat in his chest like a swallowed stone. Joe Esposito walked behind them, having abandoned the phone call when he saw Elvis moving. Joe's face had not recovered its color. Whatever Elvis had whispered to him in the corridor, the words that preceded the 20-minute paralysis, was still working through Joe's system like a slow poison, rearranging his understanding of the evening, of Elvis, of everything. Lamar Fike brought up the rear, his large frame filling the corridor, his eyes darting between Elvis and the other men with the hypervigilance of someone who knows something is wrong but can't identify the threat. The corridor smelled like concrete and sweat and the faint chemical sweetness of whatever cleaning solution the arena staff used on the floors. The fluorescent lights above buzzed at a frequency that seemed to synchronize with the distant rumble of the crowd. 17,000 people, generating a collective vibration that you didn't so much hear as feel in the architecture of the building itself, in the walls, in the floor, in the fillings of your teeth. Elvis walked through all of it like a man walking toward water that he knew was too deep. His cape moved behind him in slow undulations. His boots struck the floor with a rhythm that was slightly too deliberate, each step placed with the precision of someone who is concentrating on the act of walking, because concentration is the only thing preventing collapse. They reached the stage entrance. The curtain was thick and black, and beyond it was the colossal noise of an audience that had been waiting for over 30 minutes beyond the scheduled start time. 30 minutes is an eternity in concert time. The crowd had passed through excitement into impatience, into frustration, and was now cycling back toward a frantic, almost desperate anticipation. The energy of people who are beginning to wonder if the thing they came for is actually going to happen, and are psychologically doubling down on their desire for it as a defense against the possibility that it won't. A stagehand stood by the curtain, headset on, hand raised, ready to signal the lighting cue. He looked at Elvis. Elvis looked past him. The stagehand hesitated. He had worked hundreds of shows. He had seen performers pause at this threshold before. A breath, a centering moment, a brief private ritual before the plunge. But the way Elvis was standing suggested something beyond a pause. It suggested a reckoning. The stagehand looked at Joe. Joe gave a tight nod. The stagehand spoke into his headset. The lights beyond the curtain shifted. The crowd sensed the change immediately. A collective intake of breath, a tidal surge of sound that built from murmur to rumble to roar in the space of seconds.
The opening bars of the theme from 2001, A Space Odyssey, also sprocked Zarathustra, Elvis's signature entrance music, erupted from the speaker stacks with a force that made the curtain physically vibrate. And Elvis walked through it. The light hit him like a wall, white and gold and merciless. The stage lights turned his jumpsuit into a blinding geometry of reflection, rhinestones and gemstones throwing fragments of light across the first 20 rows like a disco ball made of a human being. The roar of the crowd was no longer sound. It was pressure, physical, atmospheric pressure, a change in the density of the air that pushed against his chest and face and made breathing a conscious act. He crossed the stage to the microphone stand at center. The TCB band was already playing. They had been vamping, stretching the intro, covering for the delay with the professional instinct of musicians who had learned to read Elvis's rhythms the way sailors read weather. James Burton on guitar, Ronnie Tutt on drums, Jerry Sheff on bass, Glenn Hardin on piano. These were not just backup musicians. They were some of the finest players in the world, and they had been navigating Elvis's unpredictability for years with a combination of extraordinary skill and almost psychic intuition. They saw him take the stage. They saw him reach the microphone, and they launched into the opening riff of C.C. Rider, the standard opener, the song that every audience expected, the familiar gateway into the 2-hour journey that an Elvis concert was designed to be. Elvis took the microphone from the stand. He held it in his right hand. He brought it to his lips. And nothing came out. The band played. The crowd screamed. The lights burned. And Elvis stood at center stage, with the microphone touching his lower lip, and produced no sound at all. Not a cough, not a false start, not a mumbled apology. Nothing. Silence from the one person in the building who was never silent. 10 seconds passed. In concert time, 10 seconds of dead air from the performer is a malfunction. The audience didn't fully register it yet. The noise of their own excitement was still washing over the stage, and many of them assumed he was doing a bit, playing with them, building anticipation. They screamed louder. 20 seconds.
The band kept playing, but the energy shifted. Ronnie Tutt glanced at James Burton. Burton's fingers stayed on the strings, but his eyes moved to Elvis's back. They couldn't see his face.
They could only see the cape and the slight tremor in his right hand, the hand holding the microphone, a tremor so fine it was barely visible, but unmistakable to musicians who had spent years watching that hand conduct their performances, with gestures as subtle as a raised finger or a turned wrist. Something was wrong with that hand. Something was wrong with the man attached to it. 30 seconds. The crowd noise began to fracture. The screaming continued, but underneath it, like a current beneath ice, a different sound was emerging. The sound of confusion, of murmuring, of 17,000 people simultaneously arriving at the realization that what they were witnessing was not performance, it was something else. And that's when Elvis did it. He lowered the microphone from his lips. He bent down, slowly, with the careful deliberation of a man placing a sacred object on an altar, and set the microphone on the stage floor. Not dropped, placed, gently, with both hands. Then he straightened up. He turned around, and he took 3 steps toward the back curtain, 3 steps away from the audience, 3 steps in a direction that no performer walks during a show unless something has gone catastrophically, irreversibly wrong. The arena went silent. Not quiet, silent. The kind of silence that 17,000 people should not be able to produce. The kind of silence that requires a collective unconscious agreement to stop breathing, to stop wrestling, to stop existing as individual organisms and merge into a single entity defined entirely by the absence of sound. The band stopped playing, not gradually, not with a trailing fade. They stopped as though someone had pulled a plug. The last note hung in the air for a fraction of a second, and then there was nothing. Nothing except Elvis Presley standing with his back to the largest audience of his current tour, his cape hanging motionless, his head slightly bowed. The stage lights turning his white jumpsuit into something that looked almost spectral, almost ghostly, almost like a man who was already somewhere else and had left only his body behind as a placeholder. No one moved. Not the band, not the crew, not the security guards stationed at the front of the stage, not the 17,000 people who had come to see the king of rock and roll and were instead watching something they had no framework to understand. 3 seconds of that silence felt like 30 minutes. 5 seconds felt like an hour. The promoter, watching from the wings, had his hand on a walkie-talkie and was physically unable to press the button. His body had made a decision that his mind hadn't caught up with yet. The decision that whatever was happening on that stage was not something you interrupt. Then Elvis stopped. 1 foot slightly in front of the other, mid-stride, he simply stopped walking. His shoulders rose with a breath that seemed to fill not just his lungs, but the entire building. And he turned back around. He turned slowly. Not dramatically, there was no showmanship in it. It was the turn of a man who has looked into a doorway and decided for reasons he may not fully understand himself that he is not ready to walk through it. Not yet. Not tonight. He walked back to center stage. He bent down and picked up the microphone. The crowd remained silent. 17,000 people watching a man pick up a microphone should not be a moment of profound emotional significance, but it was. It was because everyone in that building understood on some primal level that they were witnessing a choice. A man choosing to stay when every cell in his body was telling him to leave. Elvis brought the microphone to his lips. The band waited for the cue to restart CC Rider. It didn't come. Instead, Elvis began to sing something else. No introduction, no signal to the band, no explanation. He simply opened his mouth, and a sound came out that had no relationship to the set list, no connection to the show that had been planned and rehearsed and programmed into the lighting board and the sound system and the carefully calibrated machinery of a modern concert production. He was singing a hymn, an old hymn, a song that most of the 17,000 people in that arena had never heard before and could not have named if asked. But it was not an obscure song. It was a song that had been sung in small wooden churches across the American South for over a century.
It was a song that mothers sang to children. It was a song that Gladys Presley sang to her son in a 2-room house in Tupelo, Mississippi, when the world outside was depression-ravaged and hopeless, and the only warmth that existed was the warmth of a mother's voice telling her boy that God had not forgotten them. The song was In the Garden, and Elvis sang it like he was dying. Not performing dying, not the theatrical anguish of a ballad singer wringing emotion from a lyric. He sang it like a man who was in the actual, literal, physiological process of losing something essential, a man whose voice was simultaneously the most powerful instrument in the building and the most fragile thing in it. The notes came out raw, cracked in places, stripped of every layer of production and performance and persona that had accumulated over 23 years of being Elvis Presley. What was left was not the king. What was left was the boy from Tupelo, the boy who sang in church because church was the only place where his voice didn't make him different. It made him divine. The band listened for 8 bars. Then one by one, they began to find the song.
Glenn Hardin on piano first, because a piano player always finds a hymn fastest, the muscle memory of Sunday mornings built into the fingers at a cellular level. Then James Burton, gentle arpeggios on the guitar, so quiet they were almost subliminal. Then Jerry Scheff on bass, a low pulse that grounded the song without intruding on it. Ronnie Tutt last, just brushes on the snare, the lightest possible percussion, the sound of someone trying to hold something together without touching it too hard. The sweet inspirations began to harmonize. They didn't know the arrangement because there was no arrangement. They simply listened and let their voices find the spaces between Elvis's notes and fill them with something warm and aching and instinctively maternal, as though they understood without being told that this song was not for the audience. It was for someone else. Elvis was crying. The stage lights caught the tears on his face and turned them into small, bright points of light, constellations of grief mapping the geography of a face that the whole world recognized, but almost no one truly knew. He was not wiping the tears. He was not acknowledging them. They existed independently of his performance, a parallel event occurring on the same face, but in a different dimension of experience. And then, halfway through the second verse, Elvis stopped singing. The band continued playing softly, uncertainly, waiting for him to resume. He didn't resume. Instead, he spoke into the microphone, not to the audience. The words were directed somewhere above and to the left of the front rows, aimed at a point in space that corresponded to nothing visible. No spotlight, no balcony, no physical structure of any kind. He said, "I know, Mama. I know." 4 words.
Spoken with the quiet, intimate familiarity of a son answering his mother across a kitchen table, as though the intervening 19 years of death and silence and impossible separation had been compressed into nothing, as though Gladys was standing right there in the arena, just off stage, just out of sight, and had said something that only Elvis could hear. The audience heard it through the PA system. Every speaker in the building carried those 4 words into every corner of the arena, and the effect was immediate, visceral, and utterly beyond the capacity of entertainment to produce. People began to cry. Not a few people. Hundreds. Thousands. Men who had never cried in public. Women who had come expecting to scream and dance and throw scarves. Teenagers who didn't even know who Gladys Presley was. They cried because the sound of Elvis's voice when he said those words carried a frequency of grief so pure and so universal that it bypassed every intellectual defense and struck directly at the part of the human heart that understands loss. And in the front row, dead center, close enough to see the individual rhinestones on Elvis's jumpsuit, close enough to see the tears and the trembling and the terrible naked humanness of what was happening, a woman collapsed. She didn't scream. She didn't clutch her chest. She simply dropped. One moment she was standing, her hands over her mouth, her eyes wide with something that witnesses would later describe not as excitement or shock, but as recognition, the expression of someone who is seeing something they have seen before in a dream or a premonition or a place beyond rational explanation. The next moment, she was on the ground. Security moved immediately. 2 guards lifted her and carried her to the medical station at the side of the arena. She was conscious.
She was not injured, but she was speaking rapidly, almost incoherently, saying the same thing over and over.
A paramedic who treated her later told a journalist what the woman was saying. The woman was saying, "There's someone standing next to him. Can't you see her? There's someone standing right next to him." No one else saw anyone standing next to Elvis. The stage cameras, recording for the arena's internal broadcast system, showed only Elvis, alone at the microphone, cape and jumpsuit and tears and light. But the woman was adamant, not hysterical, adamant. She described what she saw with a specificity that the paramedic found deeply unsettling. A woman, older, heavy-set, standing just to Elvis's left, not looking at the audience, looking at Elvis, and holding out her hand.
Finished the song, he finished the concert. He performed for 2 more hours and was, by every account, extraordinary. But what he said backstage afterward, the words he spoke to Joe Esposito, would become the most haunting sentence anyone in that building ever heard. And the clock on the wall in his mother's dream was still ticking. Elvis finished in the garden. The last note left his throat and traveled through the microphone and through the PA system and through the speakers and into the bodies of 17,000 people who sat in a silence so complete that the hum of the amplifiers was audible, that low electric drone that lives underneath all live music like a mechanical heartbeat. For 3 seconds after the note ended, nobody moved. Not Elvis, not the band, not a single person in the audience. It was as though the song had created a vacuum and the world hadn't yet rushed in to fill it. Then Elvis did something remarkable. He became Elvis again, not gradually, not with a slow reassembly of persona. He snapped back into the character, the stance, the grin, the hip, the voice, with a speed and completeness that was almost more unsettling than what had preceded it. He turned to the band and gave a quick nod, the kind of nod that said, "We're back, follow me," and launched into Hound Dog with an energy that seemed to violate the laws of physics given what had happened 90 seconds earlier. The crowd erupted. Relief and adrenaline and the desperate need to return to familiar ground produced a wall of noise that was almost violent in its intensity. People leaped to their feet, people screamed. People grabbed each other and shook each other and laughed with the slightly unhinged laughter of survivors, because that's what they felt like. Survivors of something they couldn't name, and Elvis gave them a show. He gave them the full show, 2 hours and 15 minutes of hits and ballads and karate moves, and scarves thrown to the front rows and water poured over his head and jumpsuits soaked with sweat, and a voice that ranged from tender whisper to full-throated roar with the casual authority of a man who owned every frequency the human vocal cords could produce. He did Suspicious Minds and Burning Love and How Great Thou Art and Can't Help Falling in Love and every song the audience wanted and some they didn't know they wanted. He was funny. He was charming. He told stories between songs, rambling, self-deprecating anecdotes that made the audience feel like they were sitting in his living room rather than in an arena. He was, by every measurable standard, extraordinary. But the people closest to the stage, the first 5 or 6 rows, the ones who could see his face in detail rather than as a distant luminous blur, they noticed something. His eyes were wrong. The performance was perfect, but his eyes were operating on a different frequency than the rest of his body. They were present but detached, focused but unfocused, looking at the audience without quite seeing them, as though the real Elvis was watching the performing Elvis from a slight distance and making small corrections in real time, a puppeteer who was also the puppet. Charlie Hodge saw it from his position at the side of the stage. Charlie had stood in that spot for hundreds of shows, handing Elvis water and scarves and guitar picks, reading his moods and energy levels with the fluency of a man who had spent years learning another person's body language as though it were a second native tongue. And what Charlie saw that night frightened him more than the corridor, more than the silence, more than the words about hearing her in the building. Because what Charlie saw was a man performing his own life from memory, not living it, performing it. Executing the movements and expressions and vocal inflections of Elvis Presley with technical perfection while simultaneously being somewhere else entirely, somewhere deep and private and fundamentally unreachable. It was the most beautiful and most hollow performance Charlie had ever witnessed. The audience didn't know. They couldn't know. They received the show as the show was designed to be received, as spectacle, as communion, as the transformative experience of being in the same room as the most magnetic human being of the 20th century. They left the arena euphoric. They drove home buzzing. They called their friends and said, "You won't believe what we just saw," and they were right. They wouldn't believe it, because what they just saw was not what they thought they saw. The concert ended the way Elvis concerts always ended, with "Can't Help Falling in Love," the final notes hanging in the air as Elvis took the last scarf from Charlie's hand and draped it around the neck of a woman in the front row who looked like she might actually stop breathing from the proximity. Then the lights went down. The theme from 2001 played again, and Elvis walked off stage into the darkness of the wings, where reality was waiting for him like a creditor at the door. The transition was immediate. The moment he crossed the threshold from stage light to backstage shadow, the performing Elvis collapsed, not physically, not dramatically, but energetically. The posture changed, the face changed, the animation that had powered 2 hours of superhuman entertainment drained away like water from a cracked vessel. Joe Esposito was there, Charlie was there, Lamar was there, 2 security guards, a wardrobe assistant, a towel was offered. Elvis took it and pressed it against his face and held it there for a long time, long enough that Joe started to move toward him, thinking he might be having trouble breathing. But Elvis wasn't having trouble breathing. He was hiding. He was pressing the towel against his face because his face was doing something he didn't want anyone to see. When he finally lowered the towel, his expression was one that Joe Esposito would carry with him for the rest of his life. It was not exhaustion. It was not relief. It was not the post-show decompression that Joe had witnessed 1,000 times. It was the face of a man who had just completed something that he understood with absolute clarity was part of a sequence, a man who had performed not because he wanted to, but because the performance was a required step in a process that was moving toward a conclusion he could already see. Elvis walked to his dressing room. The entourage followed at a respectful distance, close enough to respond if needed, far enough to give him the illusion of solitude. The dressing room was small and overly air-conditioned and smelled like the flowers that local promoters always provided, arrangements so large and so generic they could have been intended for a wedding or a funeral with equal appropriateness. Elvis sat in the chair in front of the mirror. He looked at his reflection. He looked at it for a long time. The makeup was smeared. The hair was damp. The jumpsuit was darkened with sweat and patterns that made it look like a different garment entirely. He stared at the man in the mirror with an expression that suggested he was trying to remember something about that face, something that had been true once and was no longer true, something that the years and the medications and the fame and the isolation had slowly, methodically erased. Joe stood in the doorway. He had learned over the years when to speak and when to wait. This was a waiting moment. The silence in the dressing room was thick and alive, a living silence that contained within it all the noise that had just ended, the echoes of 17,000 voices still vibrating at a frequency below human hearing, still present in the walls and the floor and the molecules of air. Elvis spoke without turning from the mirror. His voice was quiet, conversational, almost casual, the voice of a man making an observation about the weather or the quality of the coffee. She showed me how it ends, Joe. Joe didn't move. His hand was on the door frame and his fingers tightened around it until his knuckles went white. He didn't ask who, he didn't ask what, he knew. Everyone in that corridor had known since the moment Elvis whispered those first inaudible words hours earlier. They had known without knowing, understood without understanding, the way that animals understand an approaching earthquake, not through information but through vibration, through some ancient sensory apparatus that civilized humans have nearly but not entirely abandoned. She showed me how it ends. Joe wanted to respond. He wanted to say something rational, something grounding, something that would pull Elvis back from whatever edge he was standing on and return him to the world of schedules and contracts and tour dates and the manageable, navigable chaos of being Elvis Presley in 1977. But the words wouldn't come. They wouldn't come because Joe had heard the whisper in the corridor. He had heard what Elvis said before the show. And what Elvis had said before the show was connected to what he was saying now in a way that formed a through line so clear and so terrible that responding to it with rationality felt not just inadequate but obscene. Joe stood there. Elvis sat there. The mirror reflected both of them, two men separated by 6 feet of dressing room and an infinite distance of understanding. Then Elvis said something else. He said it to the mirror, to his own reflection, or perhaps to the presence that he seemed to believe was with him always now. The presence that had started in dreams and migrated into waking life and was standing perhaps just behind his left shoulder, just out of frame, just beyond the edge of what mirrors are designed to show. He said, "It's a bathroom." 3 words, ordinary words. Words that in any other context would carry no weight, no significance, no capacity for dread. But in this context, in the context of the dreams, of the white-tiled room, of Gladys's silent pointing, of the clock on the wall showing a time that Larry Geller had never revealed, those 3 words landed in the dressing room like a detonation, because Elvis was not describing a dream anymore. He was describing a memory of something that hadn't happened yet. Joe left the dressing room. He walked down the corridor and he found a payphone and he called someone, not the same person he had called before the show, someone different, someone whose identity has been debated for decades. Some accounts say he called Elvis's physician, Dr. George Nishapoulos. Others say he called Vernon Presley, Elvis's father. One account, unverified but persistent, says he called a priest. Whoever he called, the conversation was brief. Joe spoke in a low voice, his back to the corridor, his forehead pressed against the wall above the phone. When he hung up, he stood there for a moment motionless, and then he hit the wall with the flat of his palm, not hard, not violently, but with the specific frustrated force of a man who has just been told something he already knew and didn't want confirmed. That night, the entourage loaded into the cars and drove to the airport. Elvis traveled by private plane, a Convair 880 he had named the Lisa Marie after his daughter. On the plane, Elvis sat alone in the back compartment, a section he had customized with a bed and a television and heavy curtains that could be drawn to create a sealed private space within the aircraft. No one disturbed him. The flight back to Memphis took less than 2 hours. When the plane landed and the entourage drove through the gates of Graceland, the sun was beginning to rise. Elvis went directly upstairs. He did not eat, he did not ask for company, he did not request his usual medications, an omission so unusual that his personal nurse noted it with concern. He went to his bedroom, he closed the door, and he slept. But before he slept, in the narrow window between entering the room and surrendering to unconsciousness, he did one thing that nobody witnessed, but that was discovered the next day by a member of the household staff. He had taken the photographs of Gladys, the collection that still covered a section of his bed, and arranged them in a specific pattern, not randomly, not sentimentally. The photographs were arranged in chronological order, beginning with the earliest known photo of Gladys as a young woman and ending with the last photograph taken of her before her death in 1958. They formed a timeline. A life laid out in images across the bedspread of her son's bed. And at the end of the timeline, after the last photograph, in the space where the next image would logically go, Elvis had placed a single object. Not a photograph, a clock, a small travel clock from his bedside table. It was stopped. The hands were frozen at a specific time, the same time one can only assume that he had seen on the wall in his mother's dream, the time that Larry Geller knew but never spoke. The time that had been confirmed by a phone call at 2:47 a.m. from a voice that no one could identify. The time that was ticking toward Elvis Presley with the patience and inevitability of something that had already happened and was simply waiting for the calendar to catch up. In the weeks that followed, Elvis changed. Not deteriorated, that had been happening for years and was too gradual to constitute a change. He shifted. The axis of his personality tilted towards something that the people around him found simultaneously beautiful and terrifying. He became generous to an almost reckless degree. He gave away cars. He gave away jewelry. He gave away cash in amounts that made his accountants physically ill. He walked up to strangers at the Graceland gates and handed them things, watches, rings, sometimes the shirt he was wearing. He tipped waitresses in amounts that exceeded the cost of the meal by factors of 10 or 20. He bought a woman a house because she mentioned in passing that her landlord was raising the rent. The giving had always been part of Elvis's character. He was pathologically generous, had been since he earned his first dollar, driven by a combination of genuine compassion and the deep-rooted terror of a man who grew up in poverty and feared on some cellular level that the money would disappear as suddenly as it had appeared. But this was different. This wasn't generosity. This was divestiture. This was the systematic, accelerating shedding of material possessions by a man who was preparing to go somewhere that possessions couldn't follow. No one said it out loud. The Memphis Mafia, the staff, the family, they all saw it, and none of them named it because naming it would have made it real. Instead, they watched. They watched Elvis give away pieces of his life with the calm focus of a man cleaning out a house before a long journey, and they said nothing. Because what do you say to a man who is packing for a trip he hasn't announced to a destination he won't name? What do you say when every instinct in your body tells you where he's going but your mind refuses to form the word? You say nothing. You watch. You take the ring when he offers it. You accept the car keys. You say thank you and you smile and you pretend that this is normal, that this is just Elvis being Elvis, that the most generous man in the world is simply being generous and there is nothing underneath it, no subtext, no farewell, no slowly closing door. And at night when Graceland is quiet and the gates are closed and Elvis is upstairs behind his sealed curtains in his darkened room, you lie awake and you listen to the silence and you wonder if tonight is the night the dream changes. If tonight is the night Gladys stops holding out her hand and starts pulling. Elvis had 8 weeks left, he knew it. The clock on the photographs told the time, the dreams told the place, and the song his mother gave him, the one he didn't want to sing, was not in the garden. It was something else, something he hadn't sung yet, something he was saving for the very end. And the woman who collapsed in the front row, she was found 6 years later by a journalist. What she said about that night would make him put down his pen and walk away from the story entirely. The weeks after the concert moved with a strange quality of time, simultaneously slow and accelerating, each day feeling both endless and insufficient. Elvis continued to tour. He performed in cities across the country, stepping onto stages and becoming the character that audiences expected, delivering shows that ranged from transcendent to troubled, from electrifying to concerning. Some nights he was the Elvis of legend, commanding, charismatic, possessed of a voice that could silence an arena with a single sustained note. Other nights he was something else, confused, forgetting lyrics to songs he had sung 10,000 times, sweating through jumpsuits that no longer fit properly, his body betraying him in ways that the lighting designers worked overtime to conceal. But even on the bad nights there were moments. Flashes. Instances where the real thing broke through the deteriorating surface and reminded everyone in the building why they had come, why they had paid, why they would tell their grandchildren about this night for the rest of their lives. Those moments were becoming rarer. And the people closest to Elvis understood, without discussing it, that they were witnessing the final movement of a symphony that had been playing for 23 years. At Graceland, the atmosphere shifted in ways that were difficult to articulate but impossible to ignore. The house had always been chaotic, a constant flow of visitors and staff and hangers-on, telephones ringing at all hours, televisions playing in multiple rooms simultaneously, the dense overlapping noise of a life that refused to hold still. But now the chaos had a different texture. It was thinner, more brittle. The laughter that echoed through the halls sounded slightly forced, as though everyone was performing normalcy for an audience of each other. Elvis spent more time in his bedroom. This was not unusual. He had always been a creature of that upstairs sanctuary, emerging at night like a nocturnal animal, sleeping through the Memphis afternoons while the world conducted its daylight business without him. But the quality of his seclusion changed. He wasn't just sleeping, he was doing something else up there, reading. Thinking, preparing, the books on his nightstand shifted. The metaphysical texts and numerology manuals that had fascinated him for years were joined by simpler volumes, the Bible specifically, not as an object of study but as something to be held. He kept it close. He kept it open. Visitors who were admitted to his bedroom reported that the Bible was always nearby, often open to the same passages: Psalms, Ecclesiastes, the Gospel of John, passages about eternal life. Passages about death as a doorway, passages about reunion with those who had gone before. He called his daughter Lisa Marie more frequently than usual. The conversations were long and meandering, Elvis asking questions about her school and her friends and her mother with an attention to detail that surprised those who overheard. He wasn't distracted during these calls. He wasn't medicated into vagueness. He was present in a way that he hadn't been present for years, focused on his daughter's voice as though he was memorizing it, recording it, storing it somewhere deep where he could access it later. One night, approximately 3 weeks before the end, Elvis did something that nobody in his inner circle had ever witnessed. He apologized, not for a specific incident, not for a particular wrong. He gathered several members of the Memphis Mafia in the den at Graceland: Joe Esposito, Charlie Hodge, Billy Smith, a few others, and he apologized for everything. For the years of erratic behavior, for the demands and the tantrums and the impossible expectations. For the ways he had used them and needed them and failed to see them as complete human beings separate from their function in his life. He cried during this apology. They all cried. The room was thick with years of accumulated tension finally releasing, old wounds opening and closing in the same breath. When it was over, Elvis embraced each of them individually, long embraces, the kind you give someone you're not sure you'll see again. Nobody said what they were all thinking. The thought was too large, too impossible, too much like giving up, so they said goodnight instead. They said see you tomorrow. They said the small meaningless things that people say when the meaningful things are too heavy to lift. And Elvis went back upstairs, alone, to the bedroom with the sealed curtains, to the photographs of Gladys still arranged in their timeline, to the stopped clock still sitting at the end of the sequence, to the dreams that came every night now without exception. The dreams had evolved one final time. In these final iterations, Gladys no longer stood at the foot of the bed. She no longer led Elvis through the wrong-angled hallways of the dream Graceland. She no longer pointed at the white-tiled room or the clock on the wall. In these final dreams, she simply sat beside him on the edge of his bed, close enough that he could smell her, the particular scent of his mother that had lived in his memory for 19 years, a combination of kitchen and garden and the specific warmth of her skin. She sat beside him and she held his hand, not pulling, not urging, just holding, and she spoke to him. For the first time since the dreams began, Gladys spoke. Elvis told Larry Geller what she said. He told him in a conversation that took place approximately 10 days before August 16, 1977. Larry listened and did not interrupt, even though every instinct in his body was screaming at him to say something, to argue, to present a counter-narrative that might alter the trajectory Elvis seemed determined to follow. What Gladys said in the dreams, according to what Elvis told Larry, was this. She told him that she was waiting. She told him that the separation was almost over. She told him that the weight he had been carrying, the impossible weight of being Elvis Presley, of being a symbol and a product and a phenomenon rather than a human being, that weight would soon be lifted. She told him she was proud of him. She told him she had always been proud of him, even during the years when his choices had broken her heart, even when the fame and the drugs and the distance had transformed her boy into someone she barely recognized. She told him that none of that mattered where she was. She told him that where she was, he would be her son again, just her son. Just the boy who sang in church and brought her flowers and promised her that one day he would buy her a house with rooms she would never have to clean. And she told him one more thing. She told him the song Not in the Garden. That was the song he had sung for the audience, the song he had allowed the world to hear. The real song, the final song, the one Gladys had given him in the dreams, was something else. Something he hadn't sung publicly in years, something he was saving. Larry asked him what song it was. Elvis smiled, a strange, peaceful smile that looked out of place on a face that had been marked by exhaustion and chemical damage and the slow erosion of physical health. He said he would sing it when the time came. He said he would know when the time came. He said his mother would tell him. The time came on August 16, 1977. The facts of that day have been documented extensively. Elvis had returned to Graceland after his last tour. He was scheduled to leave for another tour the following day, a departure that would never happen. The night before, he had played racquetball with his cousin Billy Smith and Billy's wife Jo. It was around 4 in the morning. Elvis was energetic, unusually so. He played for about an hour, then sat at the piano in the racquetball court and began to sing. He sang 2 songs. The first was Blue Eyes Crying in the Rain. The second, the last song Elvis Presley ever sang, was Unchained Melody. He sang it alone at the piano in the middle of the night to an audience of 2 people who had no idea they were witnessing a finale. Billy and Joe Smith both later described the experience as overwhelming. Elvis's voice filled the small court with a power and emotion that seemed disconnected from the physical state of the man producing it. He was heavy, he was tired. His body was failing in ways that were visible to everyone who looked at him. But his voice in that moment on that night was the voice of someone who had access to something beyond the physical. It was the voice of someone who was already partly somewhere else. When he finished singing, Elvis closed the piano. He looked at Billy and Joe with an expression they couldn't read, and he said goodnight. He went upstairs. He read for several hours. He took medications, the complicated cocktail that his doctors had prescribed, the same combination that had become necessary for him to achieve even basic sleep. Around 6:00 a.m., his girlfriend Ginger Alden saw him reading. They spoke briefly. She went asleep. Elvis continued reading. Around 9:00 a.m., according to the timeline reconstructed by investigators, Elvis walked into the bathroom attached to his bedroom suite. A bathroom, white, tiled. A room that looked, according to those who saw it later, exactly like the room Gladys had shown him in the dreams. The room he had described to Larry Geller, the room that had appeared night after night in visions so specific they felt like memories of something that hadn't happened yet. The clock on the wall read 2:30 p.m. when Ginger Alden woke and found him. Whether that was the time on the clock in the dream, the time that Larry Geller knew but never revealed, remains unknown. What is known is that Elvis Aaron Presley was pronounced dead at Baptist Memorial Hospital in Memphis at 3:30 p.m. on August 16, 1977. The cause of death was listed as cardiac arrhythmia. His heart had stopped. The most documented heart in American history, the heart that had been examined and monitored and medicated and worried over for years, simply stopped beating in a white-tiled bathroom at Graceland. He was 42 years old. He was buried next to his mother. The funeral was held at Graceland 2 days later. 80,000 people lined the streets of Memphis. The world mourned in a way that seemed disproportionate to the death of any single human being because Elvis had never been a single human being. He had been a mirror and a dream and a container for collective desires that exceeded any individual capacity to hold them. But the story doesn't end there. The story never ends where we expect it to. Because 6 years later, in 1983, a journalist named Michael Harrison tracked down the woman who had collapsed in the front row on the night Elvis refused to sing. Her name was never published. She requested anonymity, and Harrison honored the request, even though what she told him made him question everything he thought he understood about the boundaries between the living and the dead. She was 53 years old when he found her. She lived in a small town in Tennessee, less than 100 miles from Memphis. She had never attended another concert after that night in 1977. She had never listened to an Elvis record. She had removed everything related to Elvis from her home, the albums, the photographs, the ticket stubs she had saved from every show she had ever attended. When Harrison asked her why, she didn't answer immediately. She made tea. She sat across from him in a small kitchen with yellow curtains, and she looked at him with eyes that had seen something they were never meant to see. And then she told him. She told him about the figure she saw standing next to Elvis on that stage. A woman, older, heavy-set, dressed in clothes that were decades out of fashion, standing just to Elvis's left in a space that should have been empty, in a space that the cameras showed was empty, in a space that 17,000 other people confirmed was empty. But she was there. The woman in the front row saw her with the same clarity that she saw Elvis himself, and the figure was not just standing there. The figure was singing. Her lips were moving in perfect synchronization with Elvis's. When he sang in the garden, the figure sang with him, not as harmony, not as accompaniment, but as the primary voice, the source, the origin from which Elvis's voice seemed to draw its impossible power on that particular night. And when Elvis stopped singing and spoke into the microphone, "I know, Mama, I know," the figure smiled. The woman in the front row saw the smile. She saw it clearly. She saw it, and she felt something move through her body that was not fear, not exactly. It was recognition. The recognition of being in the presence of something that violated every rule she had ever been taught about how reality operated. That was when she collapsed, not from shock, from weight. The weight of witnessing something that human beings are not built to witness, the visible intersection of two worlds that are supposed to remain separate, the momentary tear in the fabric that divides the living from the dead. Harrison listened to all of this. He took notes, he asked follow-up questions, he did everything a journalist is supposed to do when presented with a story that defies rational explanation. And then he put down his pen, he closed his notebook. He thanked the woman for her time. He drove back to his office, and he never wrote the story. The notes sat in a drawer for 20 years until his death, when his son found them and published them as part of a collection of his father's unfinished work. By then, the woman in the yellow kitchen was also dead. Her account could never be verified or challenged. It exists now only as words on paper, a story without a living witness, a claim that cannot be proven or disproven. But the question it raises, the question that Harrison couldn't answer and didn't want to face, is the question that lives underneath everything that happened on the night Elvis refused to sing. If Elvis knew how it ended, if Gladys showed him the room and the time and the method of his own death, why did he keep singing? Why did he walk back to that microphone after turning away? Why did he continue to perform night after night in a body that was failing and a mind that was haunted and a life that he knew was measured not in years but in weeks? The answer perhaps is in the song, not the song he sang for the audience, the song Gladys gave him in the dreams, the song he was saving for the end, Unchained Melody, a song about time moving slowly, a song about hunger for touch, a song about waiting for someone to come home. Elvis sang it alone at a piano at 4 in the morning on the last night of his life. He sang it to an audience of two people who didn't understand what they were hearing. And somewhere in a dimension we cannot see and a frequency we cannot hear, his mother was singing with him, because that's what the woman in the front row understood. That's what made her collapse. That's what Harrison couldn't bring himself to write. Elvis wasn't alone on that stage. He was never alone. The most isolated man in America, trapped in a prison of fame and medication and impossible expectation, had someone waiting for him, someone who had never left, someone who was counting down the same clock he was counting down, waiting for the moment when the song would end and the silence would come and her boy would finally take her hand. August 16, 1977, a white-tiled bathroom, a clock on the wall, and a son going home to his mother. But here's the thing that still haunts everyone who was there, everyone who worked that show, who stood in that corridor, who watched Elvis refuse to walk and then walk anyway. None of them ever heard him say goodbye. He said, "I know, Mama." He said, "She showed me how it ends." He said, "It's a bathroom." But he never said goodbye, because for Elvis Presley, the night he refused to sing wasn't an ending, it was a rehearsal. The final performance, the one his mother had been preparing him for, happened 8 weeks later in a room with white tiles and a clock that had already stopped. And somewhere in a place where clocks don't matter and songs don't end, a mother and son are finally singing together. The separation is over, the weight is lifted, and the king has gone home, *I can hear her in the building. Those were the words Elvis spoke before walking on stage. 6 years later, a woman confirmed she saw exactly who he was hearing. And no one has ever been able to explain how both of them, the performer and the stranger in the front row, described the same figure standing in the same place, some doors, once opened, never fully close.